to the next session, this is a session on passive investing. With the present environment of tight credit spreads and low yields, a strong case can be made out for passive investment. Interest in this area has been picking up in India as well. This session will provide insights into this area from a domestic as well as a global perspective. It will be moderated by Anil Ghelani. Mr. Ghelani has been working for the DSP Group since 2003. He is currently head of passive investments and products. Previously, he served as the business head and CIO at DSP BlackRock Pension Fund Managers. He currently serves as the vice chairman on the board of CFA Society India. Over to you, Anil.
Thank you very much for the very kind introduction, Lakshmi. Wish you all a very good evening, friends. Thanks, Raj, for setting the context in such a wonderful way. I think today, as we all gather to kickstart the second India Fixed Income Summit, it's very crucial to get a broader context in terms of where we stand. Today, we are all thinking about the way in which the global central banks and central governments have started their large-scale monetary and fiscal stimulus. Today, we are in the midst of a unprecedented or sort of uncharted territory in terms of how the capital markets and within that money markets and fixed income markets are operating. I would like to kickstart this session by, first of all, bringing on board a very interesting set of my fellow panelists. I mean, we have the privilege and pleasure of having two very senior women panelists on this session today. And both of them are in their own way experts in the field of debt ETFs. So I would like to first bring on the discussion Radhika Gupta. Radhika is the MD and CEO of Edelweiss Mutual Fund. Edelweiss, friends, as you might recall, is one of the local asset management companies managing the largest bond ETF in India, the Bharat Bond ETF. It's the government disinvestment mandate which they are running. And my other panelist is Ekaterina. Ekaterina is a senior colleague in BlackRock. Friends, BlackRock, I mean, as you might recall, does not need any introduction. It's the world's largest asset management company. Of course, even in India, they were present through the joint venture with DSP BlackRock, I mean, till about a couple of years back. But within that, I would just like to give a very brief context and then kickstart into the discussion, is that BlackRock has been the pioneer in the ETF space, and within that in fixed income ETFs. So I remember very distinctly in terms of like earlier in my career, I used to be a credit analyst. So we used to track fixed income related developments very closely. So in 2003, sometime 2002, 2003, if I'm not mistaken, was when the first bond ETFs globally were introduced by under the iShares banner. I mean, at that time, of course, we still had a lot of development to happen. Equity ETFs were already in place in a big way, but bond ETFs had just got introduced. So if you look at the journey of debt ETFs or bond ETFs, slightly later on in terms of the entrant in after the equity ETFs came in, but after that it is picked up in a very big way, and BlackRock and iShares has been at the forefront of that innovation and the growth. So it's great to have Ekaterina with us here. Thanks a lot, both of you, Radhika and Ekaterina. As we move ahead to discuss a couple of key aspects, I would like to just set one brief context on the table to everybody. As we go through the brief questions, you will see a window at the bottom where you can ask your own questions or your own comments. So please keep typing anything, any thoughts, any questions that come to your mind. And after we complete our discussion, we will ensure most of the questions that you have raised from the chat window is picked up, and we'll try to debate or discuss those as well. So with that, I would like to very quickly start off with a very sharp and very interesting point to Ekaterina. Ekaterina, I mean, structurally, how do you see the passive debt space? You know, it has evolved very sharp and very fast in the US, and then in the Asia Pacific region in the last decade or so after the global financial crisis. So structurally, if we look at it from all of us here in Indian markets as well as global markets, the couple of key drivers for equity oriented passive like ETFs or index funds is pretty much clear. Reducing alpha, lower cost, little bit enhanced transparency. So very clear. But for the fixed income side, do you see similar reasons, or are there some other reasons which have led to the recent growth?
Yeah, well, thank you, Anil. I'll try to elaborate a little bit on that. And as you gave an introduction, the first ETFs, bond ETFs, were launched around 2003. But the real catalyst or the real year of growth was post the financial crisis in 2008. So what really happened during the financial crisis, if you look at the way bond markets traded then and they trade now, they're still very much bilateral. I mean, a lot of the bond markets are moving, or some of the bond markets are moving electronically, but still largely it's a bilateral bond market. So what happened post-financial crisis, if you look at the pre-financial crisis, a lot of bond inventory was held with the investment banks. Now, as post the financial crisis, we had a regulatory rule like Volcker rule and Dodd-Frank, which prohibited investment banks to warehouse bonds as they did pre-crisis. And what we've seen post-financial crisis is that 80% of the bond inventory has decreased. So what has it meant for investors or asset owners is that there was less trading or less liquidity. That liquidity paradigm hasn't changed. If not, that has actually become more complex because we've seen a lot of QE from the central banks, which actually has dried that liquidity even more. And then obviously the search for yield has intensified that need for additional assets and diversification client portfolios. So really, if I had put an overarching theme around here and say what was the real catalyst and the driver, was that a financial crisis and the lack of liquidity in the bond markets. So what the bond ETFs allowed clients to do is, in absence of that secondary market liquidity of the bond market, it allowed for clients to have a substitute to be able to trade exposures, to be able to trade markets and access individual markets and asset classes within fixed income. So real, as I said, that is the main catalyst. So very, I'll say very different to what was the equity story. And if you look at the growth, I mean, if you look at the 2008, we had about 300 million in AUM globally. That's not just iShares. And it was about 150 ETFs. Now, if you look at where we are now, we're at 1.4 trillion, and we're at about 1,000 different exposures globally in fixed income. So across all sub-asset classes in fixed income, you have rates exposures across the curve, you have IG, you have sub-IG, you have emerging markets, you have credit emerging markets, rate space. So, and that is evolving more significant, and we'll touch a little bit more later. We've seen a significant increase for the last 2 years, and specifically in this year, of China bond markets. And that was one of the catalysts was, and we'll talk extensively about the opening of that market that allowed us to participate and allowed us to actually launch exposures in that space to offer clients access to the market.
Got it. Yeah. No, very interesting context. And I completely understand your point that it was a very unique need or a requirement which led to the sharp growth post the 2008 global financial crisis. Very interesting. I mean, from Indian perspective, it's been a very different story. I think for that, I'll jump to Radhika. Radhika, structurally from India market, like our local securities market regulator, of course, was permitting even fixed income ETFs, but it was only basis pure full replication. So from 2008 till the time when, as we discussed right now, the global growth happened, we had only 2 ETFs on the fixed income side. One was on the longest end of the yield curve, like the 10-year government bond ETF, and the other was on the shortest end of the yield curve, that is a liquid ETF. And then came the huge disinvestment ETF, the big bang Bharat Bond, which got launched a couple of years back. So how do you see this Bharat Bond in terms of who are the key investors for the Bharat Bond? What are we solving for them in terms of, is it providing something different which the debt mutual funds could not provide, and hence it saw big growth? Or any kind of inputs from your side, how you saw this last couple of years of journey for the bond ETFs?
Thanks, Anil, and thanks to the CFA Society. It's delightful to do this panel and also share space with the team from BlackRock. It's incidentally, I think you mentioned Bharat Bond in a couple of years. As we are sitting in December, I think 2 days away, we are actually celebrating the 1-year anniversary of the Bharat
First
Bond.
anniversary, yeah. That's
so
right.
it
Sorry.
closed on 20th. It got cabinet approval on 4th. So while it feels like Bharat Bond has been with us for a while, it's not even a 1-year-old program. And it also comes in a global context, this discussion. I'm glad you're opening with this discussion in a context when bond ETFs globally have been one of the fastest growing asset classes. So I think a lot of very encouraging signs. Now, if I come to your first question on what will Bharat Bond solve or what will a bond ETF solve that regular mutual funds don't, I don't think that's the right question to ask. And at least in our Bharat Bond journey, we didn't ask that question because mutual fund, I think, is the wrong proxy. Because mutual fund, if you look at mutual funds today, you have about 2 crore unique investors. And if you look at the size of our industry, we are about a 14 lakh crore debt mutual fund industry, or 14 trillion, however you want to cut it. Of that, 70% of our money is actually short-term institutional assets. It's either liquid or money market assets. Our long duration, long-term money is probably less than 30,000 crores. It's probably less than the size of the entire Bharat Bond program. So structurally, retail participation in debt instruments via the mutual fund industry in itself is very, very limited. So I think it's the wrong proxy to say that what will debt ETFs do that mutual funds can't, because mutual funds on the debt side haven't had the penetration they should. The context, when you think that our FD market is 150 lakh crores, you clearly see what the debt alternative is. And in our design of Bharat Bond, and by the way, we looked at a lot of global proxies, we always hark back to the fact that the Indian investor is ultimately a fixed deposit investor. Very crudely, he asks 2 questions. How long am I investing for, and what kind of am I going to make? And I think the single biggest challenge in bond mutual funds was the fact that there was not predictability of return. That is why FMPs actually were a very fixed maturity plans or a fairly successful class, because they were rolled down or target maturity structures. And I think Bharat Bond's sort of key success lies in the fact that it is a target maturity structure. So in all the marketing and communication, while it is a bond ETF, it's never marketed like a bond ETF. It's marketed like a predictable product, which is liquid, which is low cost, which is transparent. But ultimately, if you go to www.bharatbond.in, and there are 4 tranches, you have a reasonable sense of if I'm investing in a 2023 product or a 2025 product, what am on. And I think BlackRock did this very, very successfully with iBond. And that is some of the experience, and that is one of the case studies that we tried to refer to. So I think the target investor for Bharat Bond is every individual who invests in traditional fixed income products like an FD, or invests in a debt mutual fund like a roll down or an FMP. And I think to come to the first point that you asked, what are the drivers? If in equity alpha is the driver, what is the driver for passive and fixed income in the Indian context? I think it's 3 things. One is transparency. Bond markets are known to be opaque. We've had enough sort of issues on the credit side. And I think one of the things that ETFs do give people and bond investors is transparency. Second is access, because to buy individual bonds, public issues are expensive and they're difficult. So to buy individual bonds has a high minimum for retail investors. And the third is low cost. I mean, cost is relevant in equity, but it's actually more relevant in fixed income in a time of declining interest rates. So bond ETFs at sort of the lowest cost, and I think Bharat Bond still hits the lowest cost bond ETF in the world. I'm pretty sure we still are the
I know. Yeah.
But I think low cost also matters. It probably matters more in fixed income than equities.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. I'll come back to that in a minute, Radhika. But let me quickly jump to back to Ekaterina from the global perspective.
Yeah.
If you could share some thoughts or some perspective on the portfolio management and structuring sideline from a portfolio management perspective, the key difference between let's say an equity ETF, which typically speaking or largely speaking has a full replication based approach, whereas a bond ETF typically is very difficult, to do a full replication. So one lands up into a kind of a sampling or a risk based optimization. So any comments from your side in terms of the key differences and key challenges, if at all any, in a bond ETF portfolio management?
Sure, I would say, you rightly said so that, equity and fixed income ETFs are managed slightly different. And this lies into how the asset classes actually trade. And I would say even in equities, broader benchmarks, they're not always fully 100% replicated, but certainly the way the process is done is very much more systematic. So in equities, obviously the securities are traded on exchange. You can put a program trade in place and execute pretty systematically the program trade and have the allocations that you need into the portfolios. When it comes to fixed income, obviously, as I said at the inception, it's a bilateral market. So securities have to still be traded largely through brokers. We've had a migration of some of the rates products and some of the short-term maturity corporate products in some, so I would say not such a large size, moving to electronic trading. For large sizes and for majority of all other asset classes, it's very much still bilateral. So what does it mean? What are the consequences for that on managing fixed income ETFs? Is that the full replication, it's not the most optimal way of doing for this asset class. So if you look at rates products, which is government bonds, generally those are fully replicated because you're dealing with a very liquid asset class. And generally those benchmarks are not so broadly diversified. So if you look at a general rates product, like say treasuries, you'll have anywhere between say 10 to 20 securities. It's a super liquid product. It's very easy to replicate. So you'd have a full replication on that. When it comes to the other asset classes within fixed income, anything from credit, high yield, emerging markets, the full replication is not the most optimal, as I said, because you're dealing again with a bilateral market and also often a liquid market in some parts of the curve or some parts of some sectors within fixed income. So what we're doing is we're doing the replication or the management of the funds through stratified sampling. So what does it mean is that we track the benchmark with a subset of securities only. So, and that would vary, that subset of securities will vary depending on the maturity of the fund, the AUM that we have, the benchmark, how diversified the benchmark is, or how broad the benchmark is. So I'll give an example. We launched the global aggregate ETF, I would say about 3 years ago. The global aggregate has about 24,000 securities, right? So obviously it is intuitive that you cannot go and buy 24,000 securities at the inception of the fund. And even as the fund matures, is still not optimal to actually replicate that in full. So when we launched the ETF, which we launched it with 100 million plus. We invested only in a subset of securities, which was about 1,000 securities, right? So a very, again, a well, diversified basket with the same profile, risk profile as the underlying benchmark, but certainly a smaller universe that allows that tracking difference to be in line with the expectations, but again, not spending transaction or not incurring transaction costs by buying every single securities within that portfolio.
Sure. No, that's a very interesting point, and it throws a lot of light in terms of how the subtle but very strong difference is there in terms of the way in which the bond ETF is done from the global markets perspective, like, okay, small quantum, and then gradually it grows, versus like how Radhika explained in Indian context, it was like a different region and different rationale which drove the demand and the fulfilling of a very different need. It starts with a big bang of the size and then it moves further. And very interesting concept of the sampling or the risk optimization in the portfolio context. So thanks, very useful. Radhika, I mean, any context from your perspective, like any challenges that you faced in terms of building the portfolio, or any issues which the fund manager faces in terms of creating the Bharat Bond portfolio? I'm sorry, I'm using Bharat Bond as an example because structurally from local India markets, that is the largest and the sort of like, key bond ETF that you can talk about.
No, fair. I think India has its own set of challenges because in our market, the liquidity of underlying bond markets is the biggest challenge. And this is something we always grapple with. I was just looking at some data of India versus our Asian peers, and, government bonds are liquid, but corporate bonds are significantly less liquid. So our corporate bond outstanding as a percentage of GDP is about 15 odd percent. I think China's 30%, Korea is significantly higher. I mean, we're less than markets like Malaysia and Thailand. The other issue, and Ekaterina referred to it in their context, is that here it's a fragmented market. We have few issuers, and they are the ones that come to market. The holding of them is largely institutional. So because mutual funds don't have long bond portfolios, it's largely insurance companies who are buy and hold investors. So they are actually not trading these bonds. And public issues of these bonds are expensive. So this is largely a private placement market. In fact, most of the stuff that's trading is in the 2 and 5 year range. So when you are launching a passive debt product in India, you need to be very careful about the maturity, which is something that we really think, and the segment, because not all points on our yield curve are liquid. I mean, when I was a bond trader in the US, we were doing 2, 3, 5, 7, 10. You know, that you can't do in India. So you really have to be thoughtful about the points and where you are on the credit point of view. And our regulations don't provide risk replication. They provide something similar, which is a waterfall mechanism. But we also, and we constantly chat with the regulator on this, we also have very tight duration guidelines and very tight guidelines.
No, that's a good point.
That's some in our case here is in our case that supply is a big issue. So if you collect a large amount of money and you have supply tied up, which the Bharat Bond program does, then it works really well. Otherwise, you have to go for gradual growth, as we said. So these are some of the challenges. The last thing I would point out is we don't have a defined infrastructure for market makers, which is a broader problem in ETFs.
Yeah. I think that's a very interesting point of the market maker. We'll just come to that in a minute. But good point, and I'll pause you for a minute on that, and I'll jump to the liquidity part, and then we'll come to the market maker. So from a liquidity perspective, or structurally, you know, whenever there is any debate or any discussion about bond ETFs or the growth of bond ETFs, like as Eket, you mentioned, in the last decade, there has been a significant growth, but then it always invariably leads to the debate that, there is a systemic concern. You know, we feel there is a liquidity mismatch, so to say, you know, in terms of, okay, your bond ETF is very liquid, traded on the stock exchange, having a daily liquidity, but the underlying bonds, you know, leave out the example which Radhika mentioned from India. There is a different context because there is a so-called, backstop arrangement, but structurally, as a broad debate, this always comes up in terms of, you know, the liquidity mismatch. Contrast between, like, you know, the underlying as well as the ETF. So how does that play out, or what is your thought about that, you know?
Yeah, there are a few things that we need to consider. That first of all, when we launch an ETF, we assess first of the market maturity. And this is a question related to, which might come a bit later, around the development of Asian ETF market with Asian exposure versus, let's say, US developed markets or European, where the markets are more developed, there is a large amount of bonds available. So first of all, when we look at, again, as I said, when we look to launch it, we'll look at the maturity of that market. And then the second point that we consider is the index selection. So the indices that ETFs track, they're all well diversified and representative of the universe. So what does it mean is that generally you want to have a significant concentration into one particular security. So what is allowed for the portfolio managers is allows for that flexibility, which I said earlier, through the sampling approach. So you don't have to buy every single security. You can replicate the portfolio through a subset of securities, which again allows for that element of flexibility where we don't have to be forced sellers or forced buyers of securities. And then the two other elements which are quite unique to physical, or one element is unique to physical ETFs, because obviously we have synthetic fixed income ETFs as well, but the physical ones have a unique creation redemption process. And this is kind of referring a little bit to what you said earlier about market makers and authorized participants. So authorized participants are the the brokers or the banks that can actually create units into the fund. So generally, for a lot of talking about again iShares ETFs, on average we have about 10 authorized participants per each of those funds. So what does it mean is that the creation, when a client is looking to create units into the fund, it doesn't have to go to one particular broker, but it has a menu of brokers they can go to actually execute that particular trade. And the fact that, and I'll give you a little bit, this is getting a little bit technical, but if I had to say, about 5 to 6 years ago, a lot of the, especially because I came from Europe, I was in an European team before I moved to Asia. A lot of the creation was still done in cash create, which means that the cash was transferred to BlackRock, and BlackRock execute on the client behalf and transfer the units in ETFs. 90% now of the creations is done physical, which means that the brokers or those authorized participants in the ecosystem, they buy the securities on the client behalf, they execute them through the market, and they deliver it to BlackRock. So what it does, it really kind of lifts that pressure from the system of having one single place to execute securities. And the last and not least, which is probably the most important part, but it's not just for fixed income ETFs, but for all ETFs, they offer an additional layer of liquidity. And the March 2020, which was this year, it has been a significant testament to that secondary market liquidity. And I would say on the 12th of March, I believe, when we've seen the peak of volatility and that dislocation of in March, our investment grade ETF traded 90,000 times a day, right? So you just look at the intensity and the frequency and the velocity of the ETF trading on exchange versus the underlying bonds. On average, there were some were not trading at all, or some were trading only about 5 times a day. So a complete kind of diversion in that. So what clients find through the ETFs, so the ETFs that obviously have sufficient AUM and that liquidity, it's that they tap into that layer of liquidity that is on exchange, which offers that element of flexibility. So I'd say, just recapping, I think ETFs are liquid by design. They're well diversified. The sampling approach allows for flexibility. The creation redemption process allows for flexibility. And the last is that additional layer of liquidity. So all of those elements kind of marry and bring that ETFs and into that liquid or more liquid element versus the underlying market.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. And in some way, as you explained, that it takes away the pressure from the ecosystem automatically, because a lot of them are now not happening in cash basis. So this concern, so-called concern in people's mind about the liquidity mismatch automatically gets to a great extent comforted. Radhika, So now coming back to your original thing which we were discussing, in Indian context, how do you see this liquidity mismatch? Because of course in India as well, there is a bit of a mismatch between the way in which the underlying has a liquidity versus how the ETF gives a liquidity, and then the element of the market makers or the APs. So, how do you handle that in terms of ensuring smooth execution and good liquidity without a pressure or stress on the ecosystem?
So I think when we launched the product, liquidity was the big question that we were asked. I remember being at panels saying that, why are you launching a product in a market that is inherently liquid? And my belief is that it's a chicken and egg problem. I would just echo what was said in the global context, that ETFs do create a layer of liquidity. And we saw lots of data from the US and Canada and many of ETFs where the ETFs, even in the most stressed of markets, are more liquid than the underlying bonds. Ekaterina was talking about this in their context. I remember when March happened in our context, bond markets went absolutely crazy in March. And we had institutional clients coming in and wanting to do significant redemptions, etc. And we didn't have any liquidity problems. Again, the ETFs here were also trading far more than the underlying bond. So I think that experience is good. One of the things that we have tried to do, despite the AP infrastructure being challenged, which is a little different from other ETFs, is direct a lot of volume to the exchange. I think the challenge in a lot of ETFs is that in India is that the AMC is the one taking orders, because you have a 25 lakh ticket size and you can come to the AMC directly. In Bharat Bond, we put in the discipline that unless you're about 5 million, 25 crores in size, you're not going to come to the asset manager, you're going to come directly to the exchange. And that's why we are seeing a reasonable amount of exchange volume. So we are seeing in all 4 tranches people trading. And I think today, if you create at least a AAA or AAA and AA plus product, because AA plus accounts for about 80% of the outstanding, you will see healthy trading as long as you put in these key enablers.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
I think
No, and I think that was a very interesting point, because and there were a lot of doubts and a lot of questions even in the chat window, and even earlier, like, in so-called crowdsourcing of questions which we did over the last couple of days. Many people keep getting a little bit confused or sometimes concerned about this aspect, but good to understand how you described it.
Yeah, I would just say one more thing is that,
Sure.
it is important for bond ETFs to be a recurring series. So when you launch a bond ETF, the issuers also have to know, because issuers have limited sources of capital and bond ETFs have to become a viable source of capital. So with this fund, for instance, and then I'll give you the non-CPSE analogy. CPSEs know that Bharat bond tranches are going to come out with a certain frequency. So they reserve a certain amount of their borrowing for the Bharat bond program, which means that, it becomes a legitimate source of capital for them and you have supply tied up. But if you are sporadically coming out with them, then it's not a reliable source of capital. So that link needs to be made. I'm hoping people will do this with corporate bonds now too.
Sure. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. So with that liquidity thing and the debate from global markets as well as how we see in the local markets out, the next very important thing which is there in everybody's mind and which often comes up as a debate, and we do have a lot of mixed participants from a credit side as well. People who are concerned about the credits. Very often similar approach is even spoken about for the credit, that okay, on the bond ETF, well, comfortable, you are listed on the exchange, just hit it and you are done with, but the underlying bonds, many of them could be having some credit concerns, or structurally you are not getting a particular credit view on a particular segment of the market or on a particular issuer, which could be going through some stress, or likewise in some other format, going through some up or down both sides. So how do you see this from global context, ICAT, in terms of does it result into any kind of challenges, or do you see typically the growth coming through only in high credit quality bond ETFs, or do you feel that bond ETFs can definitely become a good means of investors to access even low credit investment opportunities?
And this is, you kind of open it very, very nicely. The first point to mention here is that majority, all, if not all, of the ETFs are broadly diversified, and I said that earlier. So you said it very nicely, that you don't have by buying an ETF, you diversify, you not have an exposure to one particular credit. You're buying the beta of them, you're buying the markets, you're buying the particular subsector or sector of in fixed income. So diversification is one element. So even if there was a default or downgrade, you wouldn't have, I'd say, the impact on the ETF, again, it will be somewhat less limited depending on what the level of diversification. That's one element to remember. So again, diversification is quite important, very important in ETFs. The second point is that it's a misconception that is often raised, is that because majority of the indices are market cap weighted. Majority of the indices are market cap weighted, so a lot of the speculation is around: are we investing in the most indebted? Are we investing in the most indebted securities? And the answer here, ultimately, all of those names are blue chip names, so it's similar to equities, right? So, and ultimately, you have to assume that the capital markets functions well. So, meaning that if a particular credit or name is not ready to raise money in the amounts they're looking to raise, then the investors wouldn't give them those money. So generally, the market is efficient to say, okay, if an issuer comes to the market in a particular size, they should be having the right credit rating, they should have the right financial stability, the financial status to actually be able to raise that money. So the ultimate point, even if it's a market cap weighted, those names are weighted in the weighting of financial health or in the order of financial health. So again, all of them being blue chip, blue chip company with strong balance sheet and strong financial parameters, right? So again, that concern is again a misconception somewhat around that market cap weighted indices.
Sure. Yeah. No, very good point. And yes, you're right. Very often people do get carried in a wrong direction, that typically the index will be market cap weighted. So we would end up purchasing more and more bonds of the company where the company is typically the highest in terms of the leverage or something. But very interesting point, the way which you explained, that's very interesting. Radhika, coming to Indian context, I mean, of course, the Bharat bond, structurally, one can say does not have any credit issues. Like, okay, you are having a comfort of the CPSE or PSC kind of entities. So structurally, I won't ask you to talk about the Bharat bond, but generally, in your view or based on your discussions with the market participants, do you feel that in India we can see the bond ETF or the passive debt resulting into a good investable avenue for lower credit rated issuances? You're on mute, Radhika. I think the line went over on mute.
No, so good question. And, even though you said CPSE is AAA rated, we did debate even within PSUs whether to go down the AA curve, because that
Sure.
also is. And there is also interest in smaller borrowers coming into this program. Now, the choice of AAA was a function of largely outstanding. I do think in future at some point in the CPSE context, the program could expand to AA. It would not be the existing ETFs before that starts making noise. It could be a fresh set of ETFs. It could also expand to another segment, which is a big borrower, which is infrastructure companies, because again, they raise 10, 15-year kind of long-term money. Now, it's not a very diversified pool of borrowers that you have, but that could be there. I think if you look at corporate bonds, my suspicion is this should be limited to high-quality corporate bonds, because our credit markets, there are 2 points. One is the lack of liquidity. Second is, and we have seen it enough in India, our Indian consumer doesn't understand fixed income. I mean, he barely understands duration the way he should. Forget credit. And he is very unforgiving of a credit event in a bond mutual fund or a bond ETF. So at least our belief is whether in mutual funds or in ETFs, which are liquid products, you are taking too much of an asset liability mismatch by having significant amounts of credit exposure. I think one place where bond ETFs could play a role is also in the shorter end of the curve. You have a very large liquid and liquid plus kind of industry, so they could play a role. So to summarize, I probably see AA PSUs, high quality corporate bonds, but not credit products for their own structural and investor challenges.
Sure. So then this debate, which often comes up, especially in global markets, I would feel from India ecosystem perspective, we are still a long way away from there, where people get concerned about the credit issues of the underlying bonds and the so-called no credit issues on the trading of the ETF as a single line item. You can just offload it when you want. So I think I hear your point that structurally we feel it's still a very long time for India to start getting concerned about those type of issues. Very interesting. I think now just to sum up and let's say talk about future, in terms of how we see the next, let's say, couple of years going forward. And I'll reverse the order first. Maybe we'll start from the Indian context, Radhika, as the local market participant. And, like you mentioned, couple of the areas where you feel there could be a big space for the bond ETFs to expand, let's say in the shorter end of the yield curve, or some kind of a little bit lower down the rating spectrum. So to enable that, and of course, you did outline a few key concerns also earlier in the discussion. So in your view, to enable the next big spurt of growth, leave out the government pushed kind of a disinvestment, but the natural course of the growth of the industry, what are the 2 key areas you feel important, or you feel that, okay, if you were given the authority to write these 2 changes in the ecosystem or in the framework or in the landscape of the regulation, what would those be?
So I think very clearly two things, and before I come to those two things, I think I am very encouraged by the starting point that bond ETFs have taken in India in the last year. I keep telling the government that this program in itself could be a 1 lakh program. It's also given rise to other market participants building out bond ETFs. I think there are two things you need to do. One is you need to have regulations around authorized participants. That's very, very important because ultimately any ETF is going to succeed on the back of exchange liquidity. This coming to the asset manager means it's going to remain an institutional product, and investors have to be comfortable with that liquidity. Second is the operating costs of running a bond ETF are very, very high in India. I mean, this is supposed to be a super low cost product. We pay 2 paisa of IIP, we pay stamp duty, we pay custody charges. The kind of costs that we pay, it has to come down, and the regulator has to look at ETFs as very different from mutual funds. I've been arguing for separate regulations, but you really need to make the operating costs of running this razor thin if we are to bring quality products to the consumer at good prices and margins for the MC.
Yeah, sure. Okay. If I was to put the same question to you, Ikat, in terms of like a global context, or maybe specific to Asia Pacific, I mean, leaving out any kind of controversial regulatory angle, but just as a general market practitioner or participant in the fixed income markets, what would you feel, let's say, 2 key things which could drive the big growth, like, of the bond ETFs?
Yeah, and when we talk about Asia, I think we'd have to talk about two aspects of it. So one is global into Asia, so global exposures being bought by institutional clients into Asia and then the second is local products being developed for the Asian market. And one of the key advantages for Asia is that it's an open architecture. So meaning all the products that are listed in the 40 Act range, which is the US, or listed in the UCITS range in Europe, can be bought by institutional clients in Asia. So that's one of the key advantages, but at the same time, it's a disadvantage for the actual development of the bond or the bond ETF ecosystem in Asia itself. So obviously, launching global ETFs or global exposure doesn't warrant in Asia. Again, with some exception, in some markets would do so. But because most of the institutional investors can reach to buy the global trading hubs, and the retail market is, with exception with some degree in Japan and in Australia, is not really developed yet in Asia. So the main kind of challenge for us of that global into Asia narrative is the education of clients, the clients understanding the value of ETFs in the portfolios, and the second point I think is the evolution of regulation, but in a sense of the increase of the restrictions for foreign investment. So the more of those restrictions are lifted, the more of that participation we'll see. Considering now that there's lack of yield on a lot of the local Asian markets, a lot of clients are looking for other sources of income in other parts of the world, and dollar markets being one of the key markets. And then the second part is the local development, the local ecosystem, launching local products into Asia. And again, the Asian market is fragmented. So when we talk about local Asia, it's, do you talk about Singapore? Do you talk about Korea? Do you talk about Hong Kong? Do you talk about India? And obviously it's fragmented. There's trading hubs across the board. There's in Japan, there's in Australia. So for those, in terms of how we monitor, how we think about the evolution of the bond ETFs, is that first of all, the markets have to be ready. So, and I'll give you an example of a success story in somewhat is the China bond market, right? So it take 3 years or 4 years ago, we were conceptually thinking about launching a China bond ETF, and then with the China bond inclusions in the global indices, which was announced by first the Bloomberg Barclays in 2018, then we had the JP Morgan announcement, and we had the FTSE. That catalyzed the foreign interest into that asset class. We've launched an ETF, and it's been an incredible success story, right? So that kind of monitoring the maturity of the market, monitoring the market transparency, and opening to the foreign investment that allows us to launch those ETFs are very important. That's one element, and the second is just the size of the market. A lot of clients say, could we potentially have Korean corporates ETFs? At this stage, I'd love to have it, but we can't, because there's just not enough bonds available to allow for an ETF to exist under that exposure. So these things around the maturity of the market is probably one of the key drivers of the actual Asian exposures within Asia.
Sure. Yeah. Very interesting. And in some way, it's very encouraging also from when we look at it from India perspective that at some point of time, like you mentioned, it does take a couple of years for some flip to come in place or some kind of a trigger to really kickstart or ensure the growth happens like a kind of the J curve in a kind of the growth of the AUM or the interest levels. Great. Very interesting. And thanks for that. Now I'll come to the most interesting part of the session, which is the live Q&A. Of course, a couple of the questions already we covered. Some of them very interesting and some of them very sharp and pointed. So I'm trying to make sure I balance them out very well. First one, throwing out at you, Radhika, what somebody has asked, and at some point of time, maybe very relevant, not very true, but yeah, maybe. So what they are asking is that very often the people on ground, quote unquote, missell the bond ETFs as an alternative to a FD or a kind of a, okay, well, like how you have FD, come on and and invest into the bond ETF, So somewhere down the road, in terms of the anxiousness or the requirement to add new investors, sometimes this type of a concern might come up in minds of the investors that there is some kind of a, confusion being created or mis-selling for lay investor, So how do you see this? Or I'm sure you must have faced this or tackled this already from your end. So it would be good for the audience to just get some context about that.
No, very, very important. And I also realized that, the selling of these has to be very, very sensible because also as the leader in this space and one of the first, providers, if people have a bad experience with the existing debt ETF, which is Bharat Bond, the whole debt ETF space gets challenged because it's new to market. I think we are very clear in terms of what you should and should not expect with the structure. It's a structure that gives you predictability of returns, not guarantee of returns. And I think there is a difference between that. And we keep emphasizing that it's a structure that is not meant for short-term holding periods. So we actually have clients who come to us and say, can I use Bharat Bond 2023 as a liquid fund? And we say, absolutely not. One of the things that has given me heart is that when, the first two were launched, interest rates have gone through in March a lot. So the NAVs of these, they started at 1,000 rupees. And from a retail consumer's perspective, they went down to 990, 980. We actually didn't have a field day of complaints. I think people understood the point. In fact, I go on social media and I saw investors telling each other, okay, if you've invested for 10 years, you should not worry. This might happen temporarily. So that tells me the communication has been clear. And as more and more of these hit the market, as we fill the full ladder from 23 onwards, I expect this to get better. But I think there's tremendous onus on us for responsible communication.
Sure. No, very, very, very relevant point. And as you said, people should get a very good comforting experience so that the growth and the trust will keep enhancing. One very interesting thing from a global perspective more so, and of course it will be relevant in Indian markets as well. How do you see the growth of ESG ETFs, in the fixed income markets? Like in the equity side, it's pretty established now in terms of corporate entity companies which are having a higher score on ESG or companies which are so-called green companies. But in the bond market, how do you see this growing? Do you see ESG bond ETFs or something like that in the pipeline?
Yes, absolutely. I think ESG is now across the board, across in individual investments, bond ETFs, equity ETFs. I think it's become more of a norm than not. So when we look at the ESG, we definitely have seen a significant growth in fixed income as well as equity. So obviously the equity has led in terms of the overall adoption, but fixed income very much follows. And ultimately, from the client's perspective, some of them are coming in with specific requirements around, screens, around certain thematics, or some desire to actually be invested in particular parts of the market, or have to have that ESG score that is high and have a conviction around that. But a point to still take in notice is that it's a very much a why not narrative. So you don't give up returns. In fact, during the dislocation 2020, ESG has outperformed the classic funds. So ultimately for clients, it's become not only a positive element that you do for society, that you invest in ESG exposures, but also it's a why not, and in fact potentially even provided other performance. So the story after the dislocation this year in March has become even stronger, and we see certainly a strong growth potential for that market.
Sure, very interesting. And yeah, good point that it's not just about a feel good or a responsible investing. It's also an investing which is giving you a better returns or a better risk adjusted returns. So definitely it's something which is going to catch that attract that interest of investors in a much more bigger way. And Iket, I'll hold on to you for one more question. Of course, sure. Structurally, we all understand, and you articulated very beautifully in the beginning, that for the bond ETFs, or in many ways for any ETF, the core element of the portfolio construction is dependent on the underlying index. So once a particular security or a line comes into the index, it's going to be part of my fund. I mean, irrespective of whether in some form or fashion I like it or not. How do you see, looking at, let's say, some kind of emerging market funds or some kind of regional funds, the participation of Indian fixed income securities in your global portfolios? Let's say if there is a emerging market portfolio or a APAC portfolio, how much and by when, or do you see India becoming a prominent part or some part of the holdings?
Well, I think so. I think globally investors would love to see India or be able to access India in a more open way. And I think this is not something that we drive. The decision of inclusion of India into indices is driven by the index providers, as it was for, again, the China, as I talked about the success story of China, due to China's effort to open the market and some of the steps that they've taken prior to 2018 when Bloomberg Barclays announced the inclusion. And certainly that was a decision made based on, and the way, and just give it a little bit of a context to how those decisions are made. When index providers are looking at a certain market to be included or not, they go through a consultative process with the broader investment universe that actually hold those benchmarks to understand if the market is at the level that they're comfortable with investing. Is it transparent enough? Is it open enough? Doesn't have quota requirements or access restrictions. So I think from the perspective of would we love to have India in our let's say spectrum of exposures? Absolutely. I think it's more the question of is the Indian market from a perspective of an index provider ready to be included in the global indices? I think that's probably more the question.
Yeah. No, and apart from the index provider, I think it's also important about the various regulatory angles. I understand that. I mean, we currently do have certain quota-based allocation for foreigners to come in, but just wanted to get some context. And it was more a very sharp question, which I felt relevant to just bounce off from your mind. Radhika, from your perspective, another one question which just come up, like in terms of the ETFs are still in favor of the issuer as compared to the investor, because very often, large, because of smaller size issues, very often one could see the bid offer spreads, or one could see, relatively less liquidity for smaller trades to be executed. So, how do you see this, or is there any solution for this problem to get addressed? Because otherwise what happens is that the retail investor knowingly or very often unknowingly is bearing that cost. I mean,
Yes and no. So there are two parts to it. So the good news is that, yes, all our trading happens on the electronic bidding platform. In fact, in something like Bharat Bond, we were very cognizant of the fact that we should not be doing anything that's not transparent. So the way Bharat Bond gets its bids is that there is a public bidding if an NHAI is going out and bidding, and then we are actually price takers. Now, if the issue size is very, very small, yes, we can be at a disadvantage because unfortunately there's not much supply of these bonds in the market. In fact, some of the issuers that came for Bharat Bond haven't come in 2-3 years, and they are quality issuers. So there's a beeline for these bonds. We are trying to find ways to work with this. I think the second series was much better than the first series in terms of issuance and deployment and kind of slippage. And I think the overall tracking error has been better. We are also trying to push issuers to do larger issuance, so that we don't have very, very small issuance. But this is something we are aware of, and I think it's getting better and better.
Sure. Yeah. Great. So I think thanks for that. We got a very good perspective from the global markets in terms of how bond ETFs have grown, starting from the very interesting example or the actual aspect of the growth, the reason for the growth being explained beautifully by Iket after the global financial crisis, how we saw the sudden growth and the need for that. Likewise, from Indian perspective, Radhika explained in a great way that how the Bharat bond is serving some need of a very different set of investors, and which is a very large need. And also very interesting to note the credit perspective. So with that, I think I would like to conclude this session, and we have a very interesting lineup to discuss and debate on some of these issues in a further detailed manner, not with the lens of passive investing or an ETF, but from different aspects of credit issues, from a different aspect of looking at different innovative structures in the capital markets, looking at distressed debts side. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank both Iket. Really appreciate. I know it's quite late evening your time, and you are very willing just on one phone call to agree and speak on our platform. That's the power of this platform. Of course, besides the comfort of being part of BlackRock ecosystem, it's the power of the CFA Institute and CFA Society India platform. So thank you, really appreciate that. And also thanks a lot, Radhika. You were very kind with your time. Really appreciate. It's good to have a good perspective from your side. So with that, I'll hand over the session back to Lakshmi, and we'll take it forward from there. Thank you very much, friends. Thank you. Really appreciate all your questions. It made the session very engaging. And I know there are few questions which would have got left out. I'll try my best to collate all of them and post them on our blog after a couple of days, or you can even track it on our official social media handles of the CFA Society India. Thank you very much, and keep connected for the rest of the sessions. Thanks.
Thank you.